Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me today is Anthony Coniglio, President and CEO of NewLake Capital Partners. Thank you very much for joining me today, Anthony.
Well, thanks for having me, David. Look forward to the conversation.
I am as well. But before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter and make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. Anthony, I like to start with a little bit of background, just learning your personal journey to the cannabis industry. So what was it that brought you to cannabis?
Yeah. Thank you for asking. It was, a combination of unlocking my knowledge of how cannabis has positively been impacting so many people's lives for quite some time, combined with the significant business opportunity. When you look back at my career, a lot of the businesses that I've run throughout my career were about moving to where there was a gap in services provided, typically around financial services. And so when the opportunity came around to focus on an industry that was well underserved from a capital perspective, and in particular, capital for real estate, very well underserved for that, I saw really those markers of businesses that I'd run before and thought it was an opportunity to bring some experience and professionalism into that capital provision perspective.
So when did you notice the gap, and how did the opportunity come about? Was it starting your own shop, or were you working with somebody else at the time?
So I had just come off selling a previous business to a private equity firm. It was a company that I had started in 2018, a residential mortgage company. And my background is in banking, JP Morgan, CIBC, and before that, Price Waterhouse as an auditor. So financial services based. And when I was looking in early 2018, what are the areas I would focus on? A close friend who is a very successful entrepreneur has a lending business. And in that business, they had made a couple of investments in real estate loans to cannabis companies. And they had seen the opportunity first. And when we were talking about, opportunities out there, they started to talk about this unique sector that had significant returns, very little competition. It almost sounded too good to be true until they launched into, and it's focused on the cannabis space. And I think like many people, my first reaction was, hey, that's not for me. And that's what really started the encouragement by these folks to say, hey, take a closer look. I went off for 2 to 3 weeks and really spent nothing but all my time focused on researching the sector. I was quite embarrassed to say that I really didn't understand it. I had perspectives, but just didn't understand it. And my eyes were open to what it means today, not necessarily what I saw when I was back in college. And so anyway, that was the catalyst for it. We decided there was a real business plan there. We started raising money around it and off to the races in early 2019.
What was that fact-finding mission like? Was it just, was it going out to operators or talking to people in the industry, or was it just kind of hitting the books?
A combination of all of that. It was going back to the single convention and understanding where did our Controlled Substances Act come from? What was the nexus for the policy that we were pursuing in the US? Reading about what some of those motivations were, understanding this is around the time when Epidiolex was getting approved. So understanding, how does Epidiolex actually get approved in the context of the Controlled Substances Act? It was talking to some operators, and one of the people that was early involved in our business is Pete Caden, is on our board today. Pete was one of the founders and CEOs at Green Thumb Industries. And so he really understood the industry and was able to point me to a lot of good data. But it was also, frankly, talking with friends and family. Like many families in the country today, our family's been touched by tragedy through, just touched by tragedy, leave it there. And so being able to talk to some of those family members and understanding how this could have been an alternative for that family member as opposed to the painkillers they ultimately became addicted to, really was one of the things that put it over the top for me. So it was a combination of all of that.
Yeah, it's amazing how many families out there have been touched with that particular tragedy, mine included. So how does NewLake work with cannabis operators?
Yeah. So for NewLake, we are what's called a real estate investment trust or a REIT. We focus on providing capital for real estate through what is called a sale leaseback transaction. There's many ways that we can execute on this transaction. One common way is where an operator owns a property and they want to monetize that property or sell it and get cash for it, but they don't want to leave the property. So if somebody owns a dispensary because they had to buy the building when they were starting the business, and they've tied up $3 million, make it up in the dispensary, they want to get at that $3 million for growth capital or marketing or just to take it off the table. We step in, we will acquire the property for this fictitious $3 million, and we will enter into a long-term lease for 15 or 20 years so that the seller doesn't have to disrupt their operations, doesn't have to move out. It's really more of a financing transaction. Another way we provide services is we provide what's called a build to suit transaction. We have two transactions going right now, one in Missouri and one in Arizona, where an operator came to us and said, I've identified a site where I want to build a building for a cultivation facility. We acquired the site on their behalf, and we're providing them the capital to construct ground up construction for a 100,000 square foot building in both cases. And so we own it. We enter into a lease at the outset of that transaction. They get to lease it for 15 or 20 years, depending on the terms. And those are the two most common ways. And the last thing I'd say is this isn't really specific only to the cannabis industry. If you were to look at Starbucks, Walgreens, Home Depot, FedEx, these are businesses that have a lot of real estate centric activities, right? Either they're retail outlets or their large industrial buildings, and they also incorporate these sale leaseback transactions as a way to fund their real estate needs.
Is there when a cannabis operator kind of gets underwater and wants to unlock that hypothetical $3 million, how come they can't, open another line of credit on it, or I guess the equivalent of like a mortgage or a second mortgage? Is it just because it's not available to cannabis operators?
Yeah, I'd say by and large, it's not. There are very few banks that will provide capital and provide lending against cannabis assets because the activities, from a banking perspective, the activities at that location are illegal. We all know the cash coming from the activities are illegal, and it violates, from a banking perspective, it violates a number of AML or anti-money laundering laws and regulations. Now, the U.S. Treasury Department, through its division called FinCEN, or the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN had, when the Cole memo came out, had provided guidance to banks to fill out what's called a special SAR, or a suspicious activity report, SAR. And this SAR allows the banks to provide information to the federal government about these activities. And so some banks have figured out how to have the right compliance infrastructure to fill out those SARs. And some of the banks feel that infrastructure and that compliance requirement is just too much for them. And so by and large, most banks stay away from providing capital, even against real estate, to the industry.
So is NewLake at a greater risk because it owns? I mean, I get it. I get the opportunity in owning all the real estate, but is there a greater risk with owning cannabis-specific real estate?
For sure. And we have many, we're a public company under the ticker symbol NLCP. Our website's newlake.com. And when you go to some of our public documents, you will see disclosures in there for our investors around the conflict with federal law and how the ownership of our properties can be in contravention to the Controlled Substances Act, excuse me. And so, it's very difficult. That's why there's very, very few people or organizations that actually provide this type of capital. And so we've been able to secure our own financing because those small handful of banks that will provide capital to the sector, they like providing capital to NewLake because we're a diversified portfolio of commercial real estate that's professionally managed. So from a risk perspective, they like better that we're on the front line as opposed to going directly to a cannabis operator. So we have a $90 million credit facility available to us today, but it becomes more difficult for individual operators to secure that type of capital.
So at what point of the process do operators come to you? Are they coming to you, like you said, you have two new builds in the U.S., or is it an existing company, like typically at what part of the process would you prefer clients come to you?
Yeah, it happens in all different forms. What we typically look for is experienced companies, typically those that can operate in multiple states. We do have a couple of single state operators. We do find that given some of the variations in the states, those tend to be operators that become a bit more stressed financially. So we avoid startups because we like to see that track record of a team that's been able to raise capital, that's been able to manage a highly regulated business in a high growth market. And again, I wish I could tell you it always is off the balance sheet. It's always built to suit. I think what we're seeing, what we saw early on in our time was more, I own the property. I want to get non-dilutive capital. I want to raise capital and I don't want to have to issue stock and dilute my shareholders. A lot of that occurred, and a lot of what we're seeing today tends to be more of the we're going rec in Ohio, and so I want to expand in Ohio. The two deals that we have currently growing that have been on the books for about a year now, almost. One was in Missouri, which recently went rec, and so that tenant was expanding a facility of ours that we own, and then the other one was in Arizona that went rec a little bit before that. And our tenant has a network of dispensaries, and they're building their own cultivation facility to go vertical in the state and provide product to their own dispensaries.
You mentioned that you like to, or you typically stay away from startups. Are there any other red flags or territories, areas in the U.S. that you just don't feel comfortable doing business with?
Yeah, there are a couple of key factors that we look at when we underwrite transactions. One of them is limited license states. We like the concept of limited competition, which provides some insulation to the variations in pricing or how low it can go. Now, quite frankly, if you look at Massachusetts or you look at a Pennsylvania, we've seen significant price compression because there's been a lot of competition for various reasons. And so it's not always perfect, but we definitely prefer those states because we think there's demand for those licenses since there's only a limited number. And in fact, if you were to look back over the course of 23 for NewLake, you'd see in one instance we had someone that wasn't paying rent, and that was in Massachusetts, single state operator. But we were able to find a way to get them back online again. And all the information's on our website. But it's because we think there was a positive operating environment where they thought that there was a real business to be had. And then the other one in Pennsylvania, which for a year and a half had been trying to sell themselves. There was meaningful distress. They were paying rent for most of the way up until October when they sold themselves to a larger company that's bringing brands and products that are differentiated in the state. But that license was very valuable in Pennsylvania, so it brought demand for the license when the operator decided they didn't want to go. And then lastly on this, I'd just say, look at where most of the problems have been. It's been in Michigan, in Colorado, and in California. These are states where it's very, very easy to get a license. And so therefore, those licensed facilities that have defaulted have a much more difficult time re-tenanting within the cannabis sector. Now, I do want to, for fair disclosure, we do have a property in California. However, it's a dispensary and it's in San Diego. And San Diego is a limited license jurisdiction with only about, I believe it's 36 dispensaries for 3.3 million people. And so we look at that dispensary and the underwriting, and it's actually performing in line with how we underwrote it about 4 years ago. And if I may prolong this answer, one other factor that we looked at, because you said, what do we really look at? It's not only the states, we also look at what's called four-wall coverage. We want to understand what is the cash flow that this property, whether it be a dispensary or cultivation facility, what's the cash flow that this property can provide a tenant? And is that enough cash flow in an environment where pricing will come down? Is it enough cash flow for them to be able to sustain the rent? So that's another very, very important factor. And in some of these unlimited license states, it becomes really difficult to see that four-wall coverage get covered.
How did you turn things around in Massachusetts?
Well, it was, again, when we look at that transaction, it started with good four-wall coverage. And the reason that operator entered into financial difficulty had more to do with cultivation issues than to do with the balance sheet. And so it was a cash drain on their business. I don't want to talk too much because it's a private company. A lot of this is in the public domain, but they were able to raise a little bit of capital. We provided a little bit of rent relief. We have some step ups in rent as revenue increases and hits certain milestones. And we also are now participating. We now own warrants in the company for approximately 10% of the company. And so, we have a very hands-on approach to resolving any issues that may arise. And so we worked in partnership with the new team that was brought in there to stabilize the business and start growing again. And we believe in the Massachusetts market, and they had great brands. They have Kiva is one of their brands. They have some of the leading pre-rolls in the state. And they also, one of the other issues around their cash flow is they were delayed in opening a couple of adult use dispensaries. They were able to get those open during the year. So it was a combination of factors. But again, it's that hands-on approach of partnering with the tenant and looking at what we think is the opportunity for that tenant to continue to pay rent, thrive, grow, and be successful long-term.
With the combination of that hands-on approach and these equations that you have as to whether or not a business can be successful, how often do you find yourself having hard conversations with people?
Yeah, well, thankfully, not very often, because you avoid those by doing the work on the front end. And again, when I look at our underwriting process, the focus on limited license states, the focus on the four wall coverage, the focus on companies that operate in multiple states, it starts to paint a picture of organizations that have that capability to survive and thrive. And so we have a combination. To give you a sense, in our portfolio, we have names like Trulieve and Curaleaf and Cresco and the Cannabis. We also have some smaller private companies like the Mint or C3 Industries, kind of less known names, but very, very good operators in their own right. And so I believe you avoid having those conversations by being upfront. But let me actually expand a little bit and say, in Massachusetts, a different operator, we were doing a build to suit for them, and this was the Mint. And when we entered the transaction, Massachusetts was in a totally different phase of its life cycle. It was 3,000 a pound wholesale, and so the Mint wanted to expand into cultivation. They have a couple of dispensaries, but as we were pursuing the project and getting ready to start building, we saw the market deteriorate rapidly. So in conversations with C3, I think they concluded pretty quickly that it wasn't the right thing for them to go through and build this building and take on this obligation and pursue that original strategy. So we worked with them to sell that building and move the capital we were providing them there to finish and build out further the Arizona property that we have in build to suit I mentioned earlier. And so again, there's another example of partnership where there wasn't distress at all, but it's identifying the opportunity to help make them better from a financial performance and not taking on this burden. And we were able to sell our property out to a non-cannabis user at our basis, which I think really proves the value of our underwriting, the fact that we were able to sell it for what we paid for it to even a non-cannabis user.
I guess that was, I figure that there are hard conversations once you have people in the portfolio, but I mean, before you even let them in, like where they just kind of reach out, they're looking to raise capital or they're looking to get a facility, and you got to say like, hey, just the numbers just don't work.
Yeah, we've had a lot of those. Yeah, I'm sorry I misunderstood. We've had a lot of those. I'd say there are two things I want to mention here. Number one is what we always like to do is we don't like to say no. We'd like to tell you the deal we would do. Okay. I believe that's a better way to talk to people. But there are instances where it's just there's not a price, and it could be because you're a startup or no audited financial statements, or you're just way too small. You have one dispensary and the revenue really isn't there. Or sometimes it's the value of the property. There are instances where someone buys a property for $10 million, puts $2 million into it, so they're $12 million into the building, and they want to sell it to us for 20. We're not in the game of providing a markup on properties people want to sell. Well, we can have a conversation about the basis you're into the building for, but not providing a profit. And so those are easier conversations, and some of them are hard. We talk to people who are startups and they're really looking to get launched, and it's just not a right fit for our portfolio. But what we do try to do is we know a lot of people in the sector, and so we do try to point them in directions, not just say no, try to point them in directions to see if if they can go find some capital. We make suggestions on how people can refine their pitch. We make suggestions when we think that the projections are untethered from reality. I can't tell you how many times we've seen a deck where a new entrant says they're going to go into Illinois and they're going to own 10% of the market in the first year. Just not possible. Just not possible. And so, we'll have some direct conversations and provide some feedback.
So with these buildings, and I'm not exactly clear with how it works. Once you own a cannabis building, can it only be used for cannabis operations going forward, or can you sell it to other industries?
We could sell it to any industry.
Okay. Just because I know that in certain areas, it's really restricted as to where you can put up a cannabis business. I just didn't know if you were then locked in to that specific industry.
We've not come across, I don't like speaking in absolutes. I can't say never, but we've yet to come across a jurisdiction where you could only use the property for cannabis. And if you wanted to adjust and go to something else, you'd be prohibited. I've not seen that yet.
Okay. So it's not that you're charging rents. It's something called a triple net basis. Could you describe how that process works and what it means to the operators in terms of what they're paying monthly?
Yes, no, it's a good question. Thank you for asking, because sometimes we in the industry just get so used to what these acronyms mean. When we say triple net basis, that refers to the expenses related to the property. And so if you have a freestanding building, that would be your electric, your lawn maintenance, your snow plowing, if you're in a region that has snow plowing, any interior maintenance, cleaning, ongoing maintenance, all the expenses related to the property really stay with the operator. And really all they're paying for is the use of the building. And so everything related to the property is the responsibility of the tenant. It's a very common triple net, very common. Sometimes people may see it as N, that's triple net.
Okay. What, if anything, will change with the real estate market once or if cannabis is rescheduled?
Yeah, well, another good question. You're really getting at the heart of what we think is our value proposition to investors. We think we can enter into these contracts, and these are long duration contracts. We have about a 14-year average remaining life in our portfolio. And the value of that cash flow, like just think of this as a stream of cash flows. Each month is rent. So you have 15 to 20 years of rent coming in, and there's a value to that cash flow stream. The value of that cash flow stream is driven by the likelihood that the tenant pays the rent for the 15 to 20 years. And so if you were renting to Starbucks, a very, very high quality, the value of that cash flow stream is very, very high versus what's been in the news recently, Macy's, which is on the doorstep of bankruptcy yet again, or some other retailer where the value of that cash flow stream is in question. And so as legalization occurs, all of our tenants become better credit quality tenants. Even a rescheduling, if we get to rescheduling to a Schedule 3, and maybe we'll talk about that, you'll actually see better credit quality because it's more free cash flow available to our tenants. And so each one of those is a catalyst to improving the value of our portfolio.
What are your thoughts on some of the new banking legislation that has come out, and will that impact your model at all?
Yeah, we don't think, I'll give you my thoughts, but punchline is we don't think there's a big impact on our model. Well, you don't have to go far. Well, let me just say it this way. A lot of people say if that passes, JP Morgan or Bank of America, Citibank, they're all going to rush in. If anybody looked at the Senate Banking Committee, and I'm a banking geek, from a few days ago or from last week, you'll see that when they were asked by Senator Warnock around safer banking, everybody looked at each other. Nobody was jumping up and saying, yes, we're excited about this. There was a lot of equivocation, a lot of hand-wringing that went into the responses. And the only time Senator Warnock really got an answer from the CEOs that were testifying to the Senate was around equity. And so I think, they're just not interested. Go back to the compliance point I made earlier. It's too complicated from a compliance perspective to serve an industry that's legal in some states, but illegal in other states. It's not worth the revenue opportunity. Now, do I think SAFER passes? I struggle to see SAFER passing in this Congress, but I'll tell you the instance where I think it could. I believe it's very political. I think if you look at Section 10 deals with a provision that was added related to something called Operation Choke Point. This was from the Obama administration, where regulators were preferring certain industries or discriminating against other industries through regulatory actions. And so there's been a growing desire in Washington to put language into a bill that prevents banking regulators from doing this ever again. And that's that Section 10 language. And when you look at the bills, when it went from SAFE to SAFER, what was added most was Section 10. It's by far the longest part of the bill. And so why I go through all that is, if this bill becomes more of a Section 10 bill and becomes less of a cannabis bill, I think that's the environment where you can get it through a more conservative House now that Speaker Johnson's in control of the gavel. And so I'm not optimistic, but that's the path that I would see. One other point I make on SAFER is another provision that changed from SAFE to SAFER is the rulemaking period. It went from 6 months to a year. And when it comes to banks, banks generally don't like to do things until the rules are set, because if you do something and it's in contravention to the ultimate rules, you're going to be sanctioned. And so by and large, I expect most banks to sit on the sidelines for that year until the rules are set. And I'll take the over on the year. Again, never been done before. Federal regulators have never written rules for a business that's legal in some states and illegal in others. And they're still struggling to write the rules around hemp, which is federally legal. So I will guess it'll take years before those banking rules are written.
Is that frustrating for you to watch? I mean, I get it, because there's the part of you that, says you're like a banking nerd. And then there's the part of you that is like an operator in the industry. Is that frustrating for you to watch those discussions and just see how far we have yet to go?
Yes and no. Yes, it is. It is frustrating because I wish we were farther along as a country and as a government in the reform and the way we look at the war on drugs and how we treat cannabis. And so that's really distressing. As a business person, it just widens the moat around our business because there are no new entrants, and it just makes it more difficult for individuals or businesses to step in. But then back to the frustration, frustrating for people that are operating in the business that are having difficulty getting personal mortgages because of their source of income, people that are having difficulty getting business loans, getting a loan through the SBA. My heart goes out to folks because they're working unbelievably hard every day in the trenches of their business with one hand tied behind their back in many cases. And so, aside from that moat, it kills me to see this lack of progress.
You mentioned that before you got into the industry, you saw an opportunity to bring a new level of professionalism to the industry. What did it look like prior to your entry? And have you seen that professionalism kind of blossom in the industry?
I think we've certainly seen more organized and professional organizations come to the fore in the last 5 years or so. In previous, it was individuals that were regionally located or even more localized than that were providing this capital to the industry. And I think we've been able to standardize with the handful of folks that are out there. I think we've been able to standardize and bring some level of professionalism into it. And I think the industry needed it. I mean, we're seeing it even across the operator space, where some of those entrepreneurs, you have a skill as an entrepreneur, but once your business is operational for a period of time and it's more mature, sometimes there's a different skill set that's required to take that next leg of growth. And so we've seen some of that turnover, quite a bit of turnover in the industry. And as a result, you've moved from some of the entrepreneurial folks to now some of the more operating folks that have more operating experience and that tend to be, as I put it in air quotes, more professional.
You had mentioned the war on drugs. The industry has really tried in terms of, or at least said it was going to try in terms of social equity issues. Have you seen, in your eyes, have attempts at helping with social equity applicants and stuff like that, have those programs been a success or failure?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. I applaud where people are coming from their heart, and I think it's the right thing to do. But I think where the system fails the applicants is around capital. Maybe I'm biased because it's the world I live in, but it's one thing to hand somebody or award somebody a license, but it's another thing for them to be able to raise 2, 3, $4 million that might be necessary to open up a dispensary, or the financial backing to sign a lease with a company, whether it's us or an inline in an urban area, an inline store. You still have to sign a lease with somebody and get space. So there's often, I think, the impetus comes from a good place, but often not matched with the capital to make the applicants and the licensees truly successful. And in many cases, they are able to come up with their own capital, and that's wonderful and that's great. But I think if you're going to focus on a population, particularly when you're focusing on a population that was incarcerated, incarcerated individuals just have a more difficult time raising capital, getting loans from banks, et cetera. And so if you really want to make them successful, you need to match them with the capital.
Mm-hmm. If it was up to you, and this isn't just specific to social equity applicants, but everyone in the cannabis industry, what would be the easiest path to knock down some of these barriers when it comes to access to capital? Are there things that we could do without sweeping changes?
I think if you look at the history of business and government, I think there are many public-private partnerships that actually do make sense and can make a difference. I think New York is trying that with their loan program. New York State is trying that with their loan program, where they're partnering with a lender to provide loans. And so I think if there was more of an effort to partner industry and government in creating more public-private partnerships, I think we'd be able to bring the proper intentions of what the government is trying to do and the legislators are trying to do on a local basis, and partner with the knowledge and the know-how, potentially capital as well from that private sector. If you could get the two together, I think that's going to be your best chance to get at this and be successful.
You mentioned New York and Ohio. Are you seeing, it seems like a lot of times states are trying to learn from other states that went online earlier and kind of improve upon that model. But it seems like sometimes states fall down when they're trying to make those improvements. Overall, like, are you encouraged by what you've seen in New York, Ohio, and other states coming online? Or, I mean, could it be better?
Listen, there's always room for improvement, right? We're all lifelong learners. We always want to improve. I'm happy with what I saw out of Ohio. I was getting a little concerned with how the legislature was looking to modify what the voters had said at the ballot box. But in the end, it seems that what has won out was not only the will of the people, but looking at other states' failures, and getting the adult use market up and going as fast as possible to eliminate the opportunity for the illicit market to step into that vacuum and thrive and establish itself ahead of the legal market, like you've seen in New York. And so New York allowed that. It was a mistake. I think they've learned from that. I think getting the ROs approved last week, 6 of the 10 ROs in New York were approved. I saw Curaleaf opened up their dispensary today. Their one dispensary they could sell adult use. Getting that those industry participants involved in that market is a great step at getting it on the right track. But what they really need to do in New York is accelerate the approval of dispensaries. There's just not enough dispensaries. There's meaningful demand in the state, not enough dispensaries. And so that illicit market will continue to thrive until we can get many more dispensaries open in the state.
Do you have any predictions as to when federal legalization might happen?
Federal legalization, I think, is a very long way off. I define minimum of 7 years, could put it in the 7 to 10 year range. I think if you get a rescheduling, that's not federal legalization. It's just on another schedule in the CSA. I would think that the first piece of legislation nationally that focus on, I'm putting it in quotes, legalizing, I'm guessing that would be more along a states act where it respects the state's rights, not the one that Representative Joyce introduced that has interstate commerce. I think the states like the revenue, they like the jobs. I think they'll really work hard to limit the interstate commerce component. But I would expect that Washington first will leave this to the states and let the states decide. And so that's not, federal legalization either. That's just that's just saying the federal government won't get you in trouble if you comply with state law.
When you first started out, could you have ever envisioned that you would be doing these types of transactions right now?
When I started out 5 years ago, or
No, when you started your career, that eventually it would lead you to a path, and yeah.
No. Price Waterhouse as an auditor was hired by a Canadian bank, CIBC. I had audited them for a period of time, and then I spent nearly 15 years at JP Morgan as a banker. And so, no, I would not have predicted I was here. But I'm happy I got here. I'm really happy that I educated myself. I'm really happy that I'm part of a growing industry and a small part of trying to be a good partner with many, many good people that are trying to do the right thing in the industry and grow their businesses. So happy we're here.
Are you in contact with any of your old colleagues? What do some of your old colleagues think about your new play in cannabis?
A lot of jokes, a lot of asking for samples.
Oh yeah.
And there's a lot of people though that quickly say, wow, is that ground floor? Like when you started in 18, 19, was that really ground floor that you got in on? I'd say no, there were many, many people that were here way before this industry and this movement has been around for quite some time. It's now starting to get more popularity and more attention. But yeah, that's how those conversations go.
Okay. I mean, once people get into cannabis, kind of the hooks get in. Are you here for the foreseeable future, or do you have plans for other industries?
No, we have a lot left to do at NewLake. I see a lot of opportunity ahead. So we're locked and loaded and waiting.
Okay. Well, before we get out of here, and I do appreciate you being generous with your time, is there anything else that you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience either knows about yourself or NewLake?
Yeah, I'll just give a quick overview of NewLake so people have a scope as they think about this conversation. Today, we own 31 properties across 12 states with 13 tenants. I mentioned some of the tenants earlier before. We have about a 14-year average life. We own 16 dispensaries and 17 dispensaries and 14 cultivation facilities. We're in some of the adult use states like in Illinois, now Ohio, as well as states like Arizona, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, California, I mentioned, North Dakota. And so we really have a lot of experience spanning the country. And you could find us and find out more information at newlake.com.
What is the initial due diligence, and then onboarding phase kind of look like?
Yeah, our initial due diligence is we want to see information about the company's financials. We want to see property level information. What do the revenues and expenses look like at the property level? Again, that's back to that four-wall coverage so we could see what those dynamics look like. We have our own models that underwrite what we think will happen with a particular state from a price compression perspective, and we stress test all that information. We look at the property, we underwrite the property. Where is it located? What kind of traffic? If it's a retail location, what kind of traffic is going by there? What are the alternative uses for the property, whether it be retail or industrial? And then we're looking at the management team. We're understanding what's their background, what's their ability to raise capital. I mean, capital is so important in this industry. This industry has a voracious appetite for capital. So what is this management team's ability to raise capital and continue to raise capital and scale the business and operate a complex business? Because if you think about cannabis in some of these states where you're forced to be vertical, there's no other industry that forces you to grow, right? Cultivate, manufacture, package, and distribute those skill sets are all very different. And so we need to make sure that the management team is up to that task long term.
What is your management style? Are you hands-on with your partners? Is it more of a set it and forget it? Or how do you work with them?
So we have a great team at NewLake. We have a small team, but we have a great team at NewLake. And it's probably a good question for them, but I'd like to think of myself as that traditional player coach. I'm not big on just telling people what to do and walking away and expecting it on my desk in the morning. I like to have conversations. I like to make sure people are understanding what they do. As we look at our team members here, we don't look at them as being here to work for us. I look at it as a partnership. I look at it as I'm entrusted with their careers. And so I want to make sure that while they're doing a good work and meeting the needs of their job description, we're providing them the opportunity to grow, to expand their skill sets, to be able to accomplish their professional goals, not our goals for them, right? What are your professional goals? How do you see yourself growing as an individual in the professional setting over the next 10 or 20 years? Where do you want to get to, and how can we help you get there? And sometimes it's in the context of the company, and other times it's not. And you know what? If we're good partners for our people, we're going to help them accomplish those goals.
Anthony, thank you very much for taking the time today, man. I really do appreciate it. And it was, you're teaching us a lot about a part of the industry that we don't hear, we don't have a lot of information on. So I really thank you for, teaching us what's going on.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation and look forward to staying in touch.
Excellent. Well, before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me, David at cannabisequipmentnews.com, with email, the podcast, and the subject line. And you can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. For Anthony Coniglio, President and CEO of NewLake Capital Partners, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we'll see you next week.